The storm had swallowed the world. Snow fell in blinding sheets, erasing every shape, every sound, until even the trees forgot where the ground ended and the sky began. The cold was not just sharp, it was punishing, biting through layers of fur and air and time itself. Somewhere on the edge of a silent property, just past the frost-covered railing of an old back porch, a figure stood unmoving in the snow. Her breath rose in pale spirals, steam curling from her nostrils as she stared through the flurries with wide, unblinking eyes. She did not blink because she could not afford to, there was too much at stake beneath her body. Beneath her chest, half buried in the snow she had scraped aside with her own paws, two tiny lives trembled. They made no sound, no cries, only soft twitching motions that would have been missed by any human eye. Their fur was damp, their noses too cold, and their bodies too small for the war nature had launched upon them. And yet, she remained, her back hunched to shield them, her ears pinned back, her heart pounding louder than the wind. It would have been easier to run, to follow the heat of her own instinct and search for shelter alone. But she did not move. She stayed. She had once known warmth. She had once rested her head on soft blankets, heard laughter through kitchen walls, and watched little hands drop treats by mistake. But those days were gone, erased like footprints in this very snow. The door she now stared toward had not opened in days, and the scent of the family that once fed her was fading fast. There were no lights left behind, only silence and storm, and yet she had not left, not when her belly grew heavy, not when the food ran out, not even now when death pressed in from every side. Because beneath her were the only things she had left. Her body had begun to betray her. Every bone ached from stillness, and her legs shivered with exhaustion as she tried to stretch without exposing them to the wind. The snow was up to her chest now, building with every breath of the sky, and yet she kept digging shallow troughs with her elbows to make sure their faces stayed uncovered. She had stopped barking days ago, stopped hoping someone might hear. But her eyes still watched that door, watched it like a final prayer, knowing she could not last another night. The world around her was cold, but the fear in her chest was colder. Then, something shifted. A sound cracked through the snowdrift, not wind, not ice, but wood. The latch on the door behind her clicked softly, almost shyly, as if the house itself had finally awakened. Her ears perked, and her head lifted just enough to reveal the tiny bundles she had kept hidden beneath her body. Her heart pounded with a mixture of hope and warning, because not every footstep meant help, and not every open door meant safety. She braced herself, lowered her head back down, and covered them again with trembling fur. And just as the door creaked open, she let out a low growl, not of aggression, but of fear. Because buried beneath the pups, beneath the frost and fur, was something she had not allowed anyone to see. A piece of cloth. A strip of blue. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? It's always amazing to see our global community come together. If you believe in God's miracles, show it, like and subscribe now. She had heard the sound in her sleep, though she would not admit that now. Not thunder, not glass breaking, not anything sharp, but something softer, something colder, like snow shifting against wood. Julia had been dreaming of fire again, of her old apartment filled with warmth and the quiet hum of music no one else remembered. But the sound had pulled her out, slow and fogged, until her eyes opened to nothing but silence and the dim glow of a single hallway bulb. She thought maybe it had been the wind scraping along the gutter again, but something in her chest told her to get up. Something told her to check the back door. She stepped quietly across the chilled tiles, arms crossed against her chest, eyes still foggy from the weight of sleep. It was not until her hand touched the doorknob that she realized how cold the handle was, far colder than the rest of the house. The draft slipped through the frame like a whisper, and when she opened it, she found herself face to face with a ghost. The snow was thick, swirling past the porch, and in its center stood the figure, half statue, half creature, eyes gleaming like mirrors beneath the frost. Julia's breath caught in her throat as the dog lifted its head, just slightly, revealing the two tiny bodies pressed into her chest. There was no bark, no snarl, only a stare that felt like a question she was not yet ready to answer. Julia had not planned on staying in this house for long. It was her sister's place, empty now, ever since the accident last spring, and she had only come to sort through the boxes and handle the paperwork their family never finished. But the moment she saw that dog, something deep inside her twisted, and she forgot about time, forgot about schedules, forgot about grief and what had brought her here in the first place. Her legs moved without her telling them to, her knees dropping to the cold wood floor as her hands reached forward without caution. The dog did not bite. She only watched, as if weighing Julia's soul through the fog of her breath. There was something beneath that dog that went beyond biology or instinct. Not just the pups, though they were alive and shivering and desperately in need of warmth. But beneath them, something else. The flash of a faded fabric, the outline of a torn blue strip, half buried beneath the snow-packed fur. Julia's fingers hovered above it, but the moment she tried to touch, the dog gave a low, guttural growl, not loud, but layered with sorrow, the kind that stopped a person's hand more effectively than any teeth. Julia sat back, her eyes narrowing not in fear, but in recognition. That kind of grief, she had known it. She had seen it in her sister's face on the night of the crash. She had heard it in her own voice during the phone call she could never erase. And now, it sat in front of her again, not in a hospital room, not in a courtroom, but in the eyes of a frost-covered animal who had refused to abandon what mattered. Julia looked up at the sky, the flakes still falling, and she realized the storm had not stopped, maybe it never would, but this dog had survived through it anyway. And now, she had asked for nothing. Not food. Not warmth. Not shelter. Just space to hold what she loved. Julia whispered, "You are not the only one who lost everything." Inside the house, the heater sputtered softly, casting a low hum into the hallway behind her. Julia reached forward again, slower this time, both palms open, her voice quiet as snow. "It is all right," she whispered, not knowing who she meant it for, herself, the dog, or the lives buried beneath her fur. The German shepherd did not move at first. But when Julia slipped off her coat and laid it over the tiny bodies, the mother did not resist. Her eyes closed just for a moment, her breath slowing, her body trembling against exhaustion. And still, she guarded the cloth beneath them like it held her final memory. Julia stayed there for minutes, knees soaked with melting snow, coat heavy with frost, heart cracking open with every breath the pups managed to take. Then, as if the moment had thawed something deep within her, she reached beneath the coat and carefully gathered all three bodies into her arms. The mother did not follow immediately. She stared at the doorway, then back toward the woods beyond the property line, then lowered her head to the snow. She was not leaving something behind. She was saying goodbye. And whatever had happened here, whoever had left her, she was still waiting for them. But in the next breath, she turned. Her paws sank deep into the snow, legs shaking, eyes locked onto the bundle Julia now held. And as Julia stepped backward into the light of the hallway, the dog followed, limping, slow, but never looking away. Behind them, the wind howled through the trees, and the snow covered every trace they had left. But inside, something had shifted. 3 lives were safe, for now. But Julia had not yet seen what was inside that cloth strip, and the mother had not stopped guarding it even once. The warmth hit them like a second storm, but this one came from within. The house was not much, bare walls, old furniture, and the low buzz of electricity straining through tired wires, but compared to the blizzard behind them, it felt like sanctuary. Julia knelt slowly on the laundry room floor, laying the bundled pups down onto a nest of worn towels and fleece. The old heating vent nearby whistled softly, pushing dry air across their trembling bodies, but they barely moved. Their eyes were sealed shut, their paws tucked inward, their breath shallow but steady. Only the faintest twitch of a tiny ear confirmed that life was still flickering within them. The mother stood at the threshold, unmoving, her body silhouetted against the storm outside. Snow clung to every curve of her frame, melting into the tiles and soaking the mat beneath her paws. But she made no attempt to enter, as if something invisible had drawn a line between the world she came from and the one now in front of her. Julia turned toward her, hand outstretched, eyes soft with something between invitation and apology. The dog's eyes flicked not toward Julia's hand, but toward the cloth still wrapped around the toy beneath her coat. Whatever lay inside, it was not just fabric, it was sacred. She took one step forward, then another, until finally the door shut quietly behind her and the storm was sealed away. For minutes, no one spoke. Not that speaking would have changed anything, there were no answers here, only questions layered in silence and the weight of cold memories. Julia moved slowly, gently brushing snow from the mother's fur with a damp towel, revealing patches of raw skin beneath. There were scars, fresh ones, not from the weather. Jagged marks lined her back legs, and one paw was red and swollen, as though it had been caught in something cruel and metallic. She flinched once when Julia touched the side of her ribs, but she did not pull away. She simply looked back at her pups and lay down beside them with a sigh so deep it seemed to come from years of grief. The room smelled of wet dog, salt, and faint traces of detergent from the shelf above. The light flickered as wind pressed against the walls, and for a moment, it felt as if the house itself was holding its breath. Julia gently turned the bundle in her lap, fingers brushing over the soaked cloth until the edge peeled open with a crackling sound. Beneath the folds was not food or shelter or even a blanket. It was a toy, hand-sewn, rabbit-shaped, with one button eye missing and a piece of blue thread curled around its neck like a makeshift collar. But the toy was not the part that made Julia freeze. It was the small tag sewn to the underside, barely legible now, but still carrying a name. It said, Eli, age 3. Julia stared at it for a long time, her fingers trembling as she held the soaked rabbit closer to the light. The stitching was crude but careful, as if done by a child's parent, perhaps even the owner of this house before her sister moved in. She looked down at the mother dog now curled around her pups and realized that she had not just been protecting her own young. She had been guarding a memory, a name, and perhaps even the scent of a child who had once held her close. Something terrible had happened here. Something no one had spoken of. Julia stood, her breath catching as she crossed the room to the hallway where the old family photos still hung crooked on the wall. She scanned each one with growing urgency, each face unfamiliar until she reached the last frame, a boy, no older than 3, holding the same cloth rabbit, smiling wide, a German shepherd pup nestled in his lap. Julia felt the floor shift beneath her as pieces began to snap together like puzzle edges in frost. This dog had once belonged here. Not just here in this town, but here in this house. Someone had abandoned her, or forgotten her, or perhaps something far worse had silenced everyone who once knew her name. Back in the laundry room, the mother dog let out a low, exhausted whine, curling tighter around the pups. Julia returned slowly, lowering herself to the floor, her hand now steady as it reached toward the dog's matted neck. There was no collar anymore, just bare skin and a small, faded indentation where one might have been. "Your name is not Shadow," she whispered, remembering what she had called her earlier. "Is it? Eli's girl? Is that who you are?" The dog did not move, but one ear flicked at the sound of the name, and her eyes blinked once, slow, tired, but not empty. Julia knew she could not stop here. She could not just feed them, dry them, and pretend this was over. There was something deeply wrong in the silence this dog had carried across the snow. Someone had died. Someone had been lost. And whatever had happened, this animal had buried herself alive to keep their memory warm beneath her chest. Julia leaned forward, pressing her forehead to the dog's fur, tears slipping onto her cheek without sound. "You brought them back," she said softly. "But I think you brought something else, too. Something no one ever wanted found." And in that moment, the heating vent stopped humming. The house went still, as if something behind its walls had heard her. The wind outside shrieked again, but this time it was not wind. It was the sound of metal bending. Of footsteps crunching down a snow-covered driveway. Someone had come back. But not to help. Not to rescue. Something was coming for what the dog had refused to let go. The noise had not returned, but its echo lingered in the walls. Julia sat motionless in the dim light of the hallway, her hand resting lightly on the mother's spine, feeling each breath rise and fall like the ticking of a forgotten clock. The house no longer felt like a shelter, it felt like a memory chamber, too quiet, too aware, as though the past was not buried at all but curled beneath the floorboards. She had locked the door after hearing the sound outside, then pushed the coat rack firmly against it, but still, something in her blood kept pulsing with urgency. The cloth rabbit, now drying near the radiator, seemed heavier than it should have been, like its seams held more than stuffing. And beside it, the pups slept on, unaware of the history wrapped into the fur they had pressed against since birth. Julia turned her attention back to the mother dog, who had not moved from her place against the towels. Her ears flicked now and then, eyes half closed, body curled protectively around her young, but there was something haunted in her posture. As Julia pressed gently on her limbs, she noticed small scabs buried under the fur, and on her back leg, a jagged scar shaped like wire. She whispered softly as she cleaned it, murmuring names she remembered from childhood stories, names for dogs that had survived fires, rivers, even war. But this dog, this one had survived something quieter, colder, and far more invisible. She had survived being forgotten. The vet arrived by flashlight, called by Julia's friend down the road, who had not asked many questions but had sensed the urgency in her voice. He was an older man, quiet and calm, his boots leaving puddles on the tiles, his gloves shaking slightly as he knelt beside the German shepherd. "She has not eaten in days," he said, his tone grim but gentle. "And yet she is nursing. That is a kind of devotion most humans cannot understand." He checked her eyes, heart, ribs, all while Julia stood beside him, arms folded tight, her fingers digging into her sleeves like anchors. Then he found something strange. Beneath her fur, near the shoulder blade, was a tiny black ink mark, faded, but unmistakable. It was not a wound. It was a number. The vet looked up slowly, then back to Julia. "This was not just a house pet," he said. "This was a trained dog, government or private, maybe search and rescue, maybe military. She was not born in someone's backyard." Julia stared at the numbers, her heart beginning to race with something more than fear. If this dog had been trained, and had once belonged to someone official, why had she ended up in a snowbank with newborn pups and a dead child's toy? The vet said nothing more. He only handed Julia a copy of the number, scribbled on a napkin, and packed up his tools with a heavy breath. "There is a story here," he whispered, his hand resting on the dog's head for just a moment. "And it is not finished yet." Then he left, and the silence returned, pressing against the windows like another storm. Julia could not sleep that night. She moved the pups closer to the radiator and wrapped them in an old towel from the linen closet. The mother watched her the entire time, never blinking, never resisting. Her loyalty ran so deep that even exhaustion had not broken it. Julia sat on the kitchen floor beside the photo of the boy, Eli, and the more she stared, the more certain she became. That was the same dog. Maybe smaller, maybe younger, but the eyes were the same, deep amber, ringed with black, filled with a kind of knowing that only came from carrying things no one else could. The morning came gray and bitter, but the snow had stopped. Julia stepped outside to clear the path and check the drive, her boots sinking into ice, her breath fogging in front of her like smoke. No tracks. No signs of the sound they had heard. But as she rounded the back of the house, her heart stopped. Carved into the snowdrift on the passenger side of her car was a single handprint. Not a shoe. Not an animal. A child's hand. Small, shallow, melted slightly at the center like it had been there before the temperature dropped again. She touched it and pulled her hand away fast. It was freezing to the touch, as if whatever had made it had not been warm. She went back inside, locked every window, and sat beside the dog once more. "What are you trying to show me?" she asked aloud, her voice echoing strangely in the hallway. She picked up the rabbit again and pressed it to her face, smelling faint hints of vanilla and old cloth. Then, almost instinctively, she reached beneath the toy's belly and felt a seam that did not belong. Her fingers trembled as she pulled at the stitch, revealing a folded square of paper wedged into the cotton. A photograph. Blurry. Torn. It showed Eli, laughing, riding in the back seat of a car. The date in the corner had been scribbled out, but a sticker on the window said, "Missing, adoptable, shelter number 913. Julia's chest tightened. That shelter was only 30 miles from here. She had driven past it 2 days ago, thinking it was long closed. She picked up her phone and began to search, but the power flickered twice and the signal dropped to zero. No internet. No service. As if someone, somewhere, had shut it off. She looked back at the dog, who had now lifted her head slightly and was watching her every move. That was when Julia realized, it was not the pups the dog had been guarding this whole time. It was the memory. The story. The truth. She packed a bag quietly, wrapped the rabbit and the note into a plastic sleeve, and kissed the pups gently on the nose. "Stay warm," she whispered. "I will be back before dark." She looked at the dog one more time, but the animal stood before she could say anything else. She wanted to come. Not just because of instinct, or because of her young, but because she had unfinished business. Julia nodded once and opened the door. Together, they stepped out into the light. The drive to shelter number 913 was slow and tense. Every shadow on the road felt alive. Every billboard, every broken sign felt like a clue. The building itself looked abandoned, but the chain-link gate had been unlocked. Julia stepped out carefully, the rabbit clutched in one hand, the other gripping her keys so tightly her knuckles ached. The dog walked beside her, eyes scanning, muscles twitching. There was no one outside. But someone had been there. Inside, the smell of bleach and rust filled her nostrils. The walls were cracked. Files lay scattered on a broken desk, and in the far right corner, a cage sat open with the words, "Property of Civil Task Training, Unit 47, printed in red. Inside the cage were deep claw marks, frozen drool, and something else, a child's mitten, blue, soaked and frozen stiff. Julia covered her mouth. This was not a rescue shelter. This was where they had kept her. Trained her. Forgotten her. And possibly, taken Eli. The dog let out a low whine, stepped forward, and began to paw at the edge of the cage. Julia bent down, hand resting on the cold metal bar. She whispered, "What did they make you do?" But no answer came, only the soft creak of the chain gate behind her. The wind did not make that sound. Someone was here. And whoever they were, they had come to make sure the past remained buried. The creak of the gate was followed by silence. Julia froze, her back pressed against the cold bars of the open cage, her breath held so tightly it ached in her ribs. The German shepherd beside her took one careful step toward the hallway, her ears alert, her body lowered into a stance Julia had never seen before. Not fear. Not confusion. This was training, pure, focused readiness born from a place far older than memory. Someone was coming, and the dog already knew who it was. Or at least, what they represented. Julia rose slowly, her knees stiff from the cold floor, the rabbit still clutched in her hand like a relic. Her eyes scanned the cracked glass of the shelter windows, but the light outside was flat and dead, diffused by snow and time. Whoever had entered had done so without hesitation, no banging, no warning, just a quiet trespass, like they already owned the silence. She backed away from the cage, one step at a time, the dog matching her perfectly without making a sound. Her fingers found the strap of her bag, then slid over the phone inside, but it still showed no signal, no lifeline, just the dull battery icon fading in the corner. The truth was, she was alone again, but this time, it felt designed. The footsteps came next, slow and deliberate, echoing off the concrete floor like water dripping in a cave. Julia and the dog moved down the hallway, each shadow darker than the last, each door closed tight like the building had swallowed its secrets long ago. They reached the back room, a small supply area lined with rusted cabinets and empty leashes, and ducked inside. Julia pressed the door almost shut, leaving it cracked just enough to peer through. Her breath came in shallow bursts now, not from panic, but from calculation. She had seen enough of the toy, the cage, and the handprint to know this was not coincidence. Outside the door, the footsteps stopped. Then came the sound of paper shuffling, plastic being kicked aside, a cough, low, male, close. Julia dared not look, but the dog stepped forward, staring through the crack, unmoving except for the slow rise of her chest. Her body trembled once, just slightly, then fell still again. Julia could feel the air shifting between them, like something between recognition and dread. The man outside was not random. He had come for the dog. Or worse, for what she had carried back through the storm. Then, a voice. Calm. Dry. Too familiar. We thought you would not come back here. Julia stiffened, pressing herself into the cabinet behind her as her heart pounded against her ribs. The dog made a low sound, half growl, half breath, but did not advance. She never did let go, the man continued, his tone empty of emotion. Even after the boy was gone. She stayed in that place for 3 nights. Like she still thought he would open the door. Julia's eyes widened. This man knew Eli. He knew the storm. And he knew exactly what had been buried in the snow. She stepped out from the cabinet before she could stop herself, rage blooming in her chest like heat against ice. Who are you? She asked, her voice steady but shaking beneath the surface. The man stood in the hall, dressed in black, clipboard in hand, face lined with indifference. His badge read nothing. His jacket bore no name. But the dog stepped in front of Julia now, body rigid, tail down, eyes locked on him with the kind of stare that remembered everything. The man smiled faintly, not at Julia, but at the dog. You did not tell her, did you? He said softly. You never do. Julia raised the rabbit. What was she carrying? Why did she keep this? The man's smile faded. He took one slow step forward, and the dog barked, once, sharp, protective, unmovable. That rabbit belonged to a test subject, he said quietly. An emotional anchor. It was meant to be discarded after the field trial, but she refused. Julia's blood turned cold. You tested her, she whispered. You let a child die and then left her to rot in the snow. He did not answer. He only looked at the dog, then turned his eyes to the photo Julia had taken from the rabbit's belly. What happened to Eli? She asked again, louder this time, voice cracking from beneath her throat. The man's jaw tensed. He was never supposed to be in the house that day. She was activated too early. The fault was not hers. Julia stepped forward now, the photo clenched in her fist. So you buried it. The story. The child. Her training. Everything. The man's eyes darkened. And we will do it again, he said simply. Because that is what people like you do not understand. Dogs like her are not pets. They are prototypes. That was the breaking point. Julia felt the dog move before she saw it, fast, silent, brutal. She lunged with a force that shook the hallway, her jaws snapping inches from the man's leg before Julia pulled her back with both arms. The man stumbled, startled but not afraid. You should not have come here, he said, adjusting his coat. There is a reason the shelter is not on any map anymore. Julia did not speak. She only stared at him, eyes burning, hand wrapped tight around the dog's collar. If you come near her again, she said slowly, I will burn everything you built. The man turned away, heading down the hallway toward the back exit, his footsteps slow, the sound of his boots pressing into Julia's skull like a final warning. "She will not live long," he called over his shoulder. "That kind of bond, it does not last. It consumes." Julia looked down at the dog beside her, panting now, eyes wild with memory. But when she reached to stroke her fur, the dog leaned into her hand, not away. There was nothing consuming in that moment, only loyalty. Only pain. Only a promise made beneath a frozen sky. Julia did not wait. She grabbed the photo, the rabbit, the pups from the back seat of her car, and drove. The storm had returned, but she drove anyway, headlights slicing through snow like blades. Behind her, the shelter disappeared. Before her, a road opened, narrow, cracked, uncertain. But for the first time since the storm, she knew exactly what she was driving toward. Not safety. Not silence. But truth. And she would not stop until the last part of it was exposed to light. The road felt longer this time, like time itself had slowed to match the weight in Julia's chest. Her hands gripped the wheel with a tightness that made her knuckles ache, but she did not loosen them. The rabbit lay on the passenger seat beside her, wrapped in a towel, while the pups nestled inside a crate beneath the dashboard heat. The mother sat in the back seat, quiet and watchful, her eyes never drifting from Julia's silhouette in the rearview mirror. Snow lashed at the windows like ghosts trying to get back inside. But for the first time, Julia felt no fear. She had already driven through worse. They reached the outskirts of a town Julia had not planned to return to. It had once been a weekend escape, tree-lined roads, lakeside cabins, the kind of place people disappeared into for peace. But peace was not what she came for now. She came for answers. She came for names, for files, for the remnants of what had been scrubbed away when Eli disappeared. The shelter was gone, the records hidden, but someone, somewhere, had known what was happening. And if they would not speak, then the truth would have to speak for itself. Julia pulled into a gravel driveway beside an old ranger station, long since converted into a wildlife outpost. It was closed for winter, but she still had the key her sister once gave her. As the door creaked open, she was hit with the scent of cedar and ash, and the weight of years pressed down like a curtain of dust. She carried the pups inside first, placing them gently beside the stone fireplace. Then she returned for the mother, who leapt from the car with less strength than before but more purpose. She walked slowly through the snow, stopping once to stare at the trees before entering. Julia did not speak. She only watched as the dog curled around her pups and let her eyes finally close. The cabin was silent, except for the wind rattling the window panes and the quiet breathing of lives that refused to be forgotten. Julia unpacked what little food she had left and started a fire, the warmth spreading across the floor like a memory being thawed back into existence. As the flames grew, the dog stirred, lifting her head to watch the flicker of orange and gold. Then, with a movement so slow it could have been missed, she crawled forward until her nose touched the rabbit that still lay wrapped beside the hearth. She nudged it once. Then she laid her head beside it, eyes open, watching it like a sentinel. That night, Julia dreamed of the shelter. Not the way it had looked, empty, ruined, but the way it once was. She saw rows of cages, not cruel but clinical, dogs pacing, handlers whispering through earpieces. And in the far corner, a child laughing, a boy with wild curls and a high-pitched giggle that filled the air like summer wind. He ran toward the cage, rabbit in hand, and the pup on the other side barked once, soft and thrilled. Then the lights flickered. The walls cracked. And the boy was gone. Julia awoke with tears already on her face. Morning arrived in silence. The snow had stopped, but the sky remained gray, heavy with what had not yet been said. Julia fed the pups with trembling hands, mixed warm water into their powdered milk, and helped the mother sit up when her legs gave out halfway through the process. The dog did not resist. She trusted now, even if her body no longer could. Julia stroked her back with slow, rhythmic motions, whispering stories she barely remembered, fairy tales, lullabies, fractured memories of childhood that once belonged to someone else. You stayed, she whispered. You stayed even after the world forgot him. Later that afternoon, a knock came at the door. Julia's breath caught, her body froze, but the dog did not growl this time. Instead, she turned her head and stared, not at the door, but at the photograph now pinned to the wall above the fireplace. Eli. His smile. His eyes. Julia opened the door with her fingers curled tightly around the rabbit in her pocket. Outside stood a woman in a park ranger coat, face lined with age, eyes familiar in a way that sent a chill through Julia's spine. You are her, the woman said, without needing explanation. The one who found her. Julia nodded slowly, unsure of which part she was supposed to confirm. The woman stepped inside, her boots trailing snow across the wooden floor, and walked directly to the dog without hesitation. She knelt slowly, reached out, and touched the mother's ear with trembling fingers. I trained her, she whispered. But not for this. Never for this. Her eyes filled with tears. She should have died that night, but she did not. She went back. She waited. She tried to wake a child no one had come to claim. Julia said nothing. She could not. The woman looked up at her now, voice cracking like glass. They buried the records. They erased the names. But she remembered. And so did I. Julia handed her the rabbit, and the woman crumbled into herself, pressing the toy to her chest like a mother mourning a child long past naming. The silence between them was sacred now, filled only by the fire and the breath of a dog who had never stopped guarding the pieces of a story no one else dared to keep. That night, the snow began to melt. The road cleared. The sky opened just enough to let the stars blink through, cautious but bright. Julia sat on the cabin porch, the rabbit beside her, the pups asleep in a nest of warmth, and the mother resting nearby with her head against the wood. She had given everything. Her strength. Her past. Her voice. And still, she had asked for nothing in return. Julia reached out and gently touched her paw. You are not a prototype, she said. You are a guardian. As if in answer, the dog lifted her head and stared into the darkness beyond the trees. Then, slowly, she stood, not fully, not without trembling, but with purpose. She walked to the cabin door, pushed it open with her nose, and returned to her pups. She curled around them, tighter this time, not to shield them from the cold, but to hold them through the warmth. And as the fire danced against the walls and the rabbit lay watching from the corner, something inside the silence changed. It was no longer heavy. It was no longer hollow. It was home. The cabin had fallen quiet again, but this silence was not the same as before. It was not filled with fear or uncertainty, it was filled with breath, warmth, and the steady rhythm of life refusing to give up. Outside, the last of the snow had begun to melt into the earth, as if even winter itself had surrendered to something stronger. Julia sat by the window, her eyes watching the trees sway in the early morning wind, her hand resting gently on the rabbit now repaired with a clean stitch and a new button eye. Behind her, the German shepherd lay still beside her pups, her body curled in the shape of something sacred. And even though the fire had gone out, no one inside the house was cold anymore. There are stories that never make headlines. Stories too quiet for cameras, too inconvenient for news anchors, and too complicated for easy justice. But those stories matter, because they live in the forgotten places, in empty cages, old photographs, and in the eyes of those who refuse to leave. This story was not just about rescue. It was about remembering. About refusing to look away. And about what it truly means to protect something even when the world has already moved on. Somewhere out there, more dogs like her are waiting. Waiting in shelters no one visits. Waiting under porches no one sees. Waiting in storms with memories buried in their chests, hoping someone will notice the way they sit, the way they stare, the way they never walk away. Maybe they were trained to serve. Maybe they were raised to guard. But what they need most now is something simple. They need someone to stay. So if this story has stirred something in you, even something small, do not let it go quiet again. Share it. Tell someone. Look twice when you pass a fence or a snowbank or a broken window. You never know who is still holding on, hoping for one more chance to be seen. Not every rescue begins with sirens. Sometimes, it begins with silence, and a choice not to walk past it. And if you are listening now, then maybe you are already part of that choice. This dog was more than an experiment. More than a survivor. She was a bridge between memory and truth, between what was erased and what still lives. She protected what she loved until her body broke down and her voice faded, and still, she stayed. She stayed when no one came. She stayed for a boy who never opened the door again. And in staying, she gave him a final kind of peace that no machine, no handler, no file could ever explain. Sometimes the ones we save are the ones who were saving us all along. Sometimes the silence holds more weight than words ever could. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you will hear a heartbeat still echoing beneath the snow. A promise. A name. A life no one else believed was worth rescuing, but she did. And now, so do you.